There we go. Good morning, everybody. Happy July 27th, already almost the end of July. I am your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, and welcome to this, our final installment of Fontenelle Forest Understanding Nature series. So today, we're going to be talking about beaver. We're going to talk about not just beaver, but kind of their history in America, because it's kind of an interesting story when you get down to it. So, beaver are they're really remarkable animals. They're pretty amazing. And they're what we consider a keystone species. A keystone species is one that if you remove it from the environment, if you take it out, well, there's a lot of other things that depend on that animal. Other keystone species are things, wolves are a keystone species. Trying to think of some other ones. Beaver are a keystone species. So when you remove them, then it has effects on not only the environment, but on a lot of different species that depend on that animal for one reason or another. Now, when it comes to changing the landscape, beaver are second only to humans. So it's pretty amazing. We engineer the environment, we change our environment quite a bit, as you know, we build cities and we dig big holes and things like that. The beaver are number two because they create dams, they create ponds, and they do a lot of beneficial things in the environment. And I'm going to show you some of that today. So what are we talking about here? CASTOR CANADENSIS, that is the Latin name. They are the largest rodent in North America. They get up usually between 30 and 60 pounds. They're the second largest rodent in the entire world. The largest rodent in the world is the capybara, which are super cute, but they don't live here. So they're our largest rodent. They are generally nocturnal, not always, but in general, they're a nocturnal, and they're semi-aquatic, and they're very well adapted to that semi-aquatic lifestyle, living primarily in the water. Now, on average, in the wild, they live between 10 and 15 years. So that's a pretty good lifespan for a rodent. In captivity, they can live much longer. And like I said, they're very well adapted for building dams, building lodges, and living that life in the water. Now, sometimes people confuse beaver and muskrat. And it's easy to see how, because a lot of times with both of them, you only see them in the water and you just see that maybe the nose and the eyes sticking out. And it can be kind of hard to tell the difference sometimes, or sometimes if you're not aware of the differences, if you see a muskrat lodge and a beaver lodge, there's some similarities there. But if you really understand what you're looking at, you'll know the difference. So our beaver has that wide flat tail. That's kind of one of their really obvious defining characteristics. Now, you don't always see that when they're swimming in the water, but they have that wide flat tail. And again, they get up between 30 and 60 pounds. A muskrat, on the other hand, has a long, thin tail, and they're only about 2 to 4 pounds. So size-wise, when you really see a beaver, if you've been to the Omaha Zoo and been down to the Creatures of the Night exhibit and seen the beaver, you realize how big they are. I think a lot of times we don't realize how big beaver are. Muskrats are much, much smaller. They're about the size of a small cat. Beaver have webbed feet. Muskrat don't. They're very good swimmers, but they don't have webbed feet. And then the lodge, a beaver lodge, uses a lot of mud. They use a lot of large sticks. It's very woody, and they get 6 feet tall. They're absolutely huge. A muskrat lodge is made more of plant material, so you're not going to see as many sticks or as much woody debris in there. It's going to be things like reeds and cattails and things like that. They usually put it over a firm base, and then they don't really use mud. So after the flooding a couple of years ago, if you went across the Bellevue Toll Bridge, all those farm fields on the Iowa side of the bridge that had been flooded, there were dozens and dozens of muskrat lodges. And as the water receded, you could really see very, very well how they were built, and you could see those muskrat lodges kind of stuck out there. The muskrat would have retreated with the water. They want to stick with the water, but those lodges were left behind. It was kind of neat to see. So let's talk about some of those adaptations. Like I said, beavers, as we know, they have this big, wide, flat tail. And that's kind of one of their defining features. And they use this for a whole bunch of different reasons. Now, in the cartoons, you see them, patting the mud down real good with it. But they use it for a lot of reasons. And that's patting mud is really not what they use it for. Primarily, it's a rudder. So when they're swimming in the water, they're very agile. So they use it as a rudder. They use it to prop themselves up when they're sitting upright. And they use it for leverage when they're carrying large branches. They also use it to control their body temperature. So if they need to cool off because they have that thick fur, so on these hot summer days, they're going to need to stay cool. That having that hairless tail, that wide flat tail, and having it in the water is going to help keep their body temperature down. Likewise, in the winter, that's going to soak up some of the sun, and they're going to be able to keep their body temperature higher. They also use it as a warning. So if you're ever somewhere where there's beaver, say you're kayaking or you're hiking nearby, and there's a beaver in the water, and it gets startled, what it's going to do is it's going to drop down, and then it's going to use that tail to slap the water real hard and make a real loud sound. And you can replicate this if you're in the pool or in the water somewhere. Take your hand and smack the top of the water with your hand flat. So it's kind of like a belly flop, and it makes a real loud sound. And that will warn other beavers in the area that there's something here, something that they might want to be scared of. And then they'll dive down, they'll either go into their lodge, or they can hold their breath for up to 15 minutes. So they'll just stay under the water for that length of time until the danger has passed. So like I mentioned, their feet are webbed. Well, their rear feet are webbed. And who can resist this upper left picture, this baby beaver? How cute is that? So their rear feet are webbed, their front feet are not, but they're very good swimmers. They're very agile in the water, not so much on land. They're very awkward on land. So if you ever see the prints in the mud, this is a good way to determine if they're beaver prints. If the rear one is webbed, and then the front foot almost looks like a raccoon footprint, almost looks like a hand. Now, the other thing that they have is fur, and we're going to really get into their fur and why it's so popular later on. But they actually have 2 layers of fur. So close to their body, they have a very fine, short hair, and that's for warmth. And then on top of that, they have the longer hair, and that's for waterproofing. And they actually have glands on their belly. So a lot of times you'll see them, kind of grooming, and they're combing their paws through their fur. And what they're doing is they're taking these oily secretions, it's called castoreum, and they groom it through their fur in order to waterproof it. And that helps keep them waterproof, it helps keep them warm, and it insulates them. So castoreum, supposedly, I've never smelled it, but it's supposed to smell similar to vanilla. And that's one of the reasons that people hunted beavers, was not just for their fur, but because this castoreum that's in their glands was used in different things. It was actually used in perfumes. It was used in medicines. It was thought that it could treat anything from headaches to deafness to mental illness. Now, there might be some truth in there. It's not that much of a wonder substance that it can cure all that. But beaver eat, their favorite food is willow and spruce. And one of the main substances you find in willow and spruce is salicylic acid. Salicylic acid is the active ingredient in aspirin. So it probably did have some curative properties in terms of swelling or headache or pain to a certain extent, but certainly was not a cure for deafness or mental illness or all the things that it was ascribed. But so there is some truth in that. So it's kind of interesting. Now, fun fact, the reproductive organs of the beaver are internal. So, most animals, there are external ways to tell the difference between a male and a female, not with beavers. You can't tell the difference between them. So experts in this area can determine, the gender of a beaver, the sex of a beaver, by smelling the secretions of the anal glands. Now, this is not my thing. I love nature. I'm not sure I want to start, becoming an expert in the smell of the anal gland secretions of the beaver. But supposedly what they say is that the female secretions smell like old cheese and the male smells like motor oil. So if anybody has ever done any anal gland smelling of beavers and can, shoot me an email, let me know if that's the case. I would love that, but I don't know for sure. Now, the other thing about beavers, of course, we know they have great big teeth because they chew down trees and branches and things, right? So they have 4 incisors. There's a hard enamel on the front. That's why it's orange. It's very high in iron. So it's very hard, tough enamel. And that's common in a lot of rodents. And then the back side of the teeth is actually a much softer material. So what happens is, as they chew on these trees, because they not only use them in their lodges and their dams, but they eat that inner bark. So as they do that, as they chew on these things, it wears down and it actually self-sharpens those teeth and it keeps them sharp. And those teeth do grow throughout their entire life. So they have to continually chew on stuff, chew on trees and branches and keep those teeth worn down. Like I said, they eat the inner bark, but they'll also eat other vegetation. So they'll eat plants, they'll eat leaves, they'll eat, aquatic vegetation. They are herbivores. They do not eat fish. They don't catch frogs. They don't eat lizards or insects or anything like that. They are strictly herbivores. So they're eating the inner bark of trees. And that's why sometimes you'll see on one of the trails that I frequent out here, there is a huge cottonwood tree. I mean, that tree has to be 10 feet in diameter. It's absolutely enormous. And it's been chewed by a beaver. And it's tempting to look at that and say, wow, that was one ambitious beaver thinking it was going to take down that entire tree. But it was probably just feeding on it. It was just eating that inner bark. So it just was chewing in far enough to get to that inner bark that it likes. And this is some sign of beaver activity. This is off the trail down by the berm in Fontenelle Forest. So you can see these trees here. This one has been chewed all the way through. I don't know if they've completed that project. This picture was taken about, a year and a half ago or so. Some of these smaller trees were probably used for lodge or dam. And then here's a larger tree that it apparently just, was probably just feeding on. So the other thing about the beaver, I actually want to go back a slide. They have very small eyes. So they actually have very, very poor eyesight. They do have transparent eyelids that they can close so they can see underwater. But the other thing that I find fascinating is they have 2 sets of lips. So they have these lips in front of their teeth, but then behind their teeth, they have a second set of lips. They're fur-lined lips, and they can close those behind their teeth. And what that lets them do is chew on things underwater. So they can chew on these branches underwater, or they can carry them while they're swimming, and it's not pushing water down their throat. If I tried to hold something in my teeth while swimming underwater, it would push a whole bunch of water down my throat and I would end up coughing and choking and carrying on. But it lets them chew sticks in the water, and it lets them carry branches in the water without drowning. So it's kind of cool how that's evolved. So dams, we all know beavers build dams, except they don't always build dams, actually. If they have a pool of water that's deep enough, they might not build a dam. So the purpose of the dam is to create an area of still water that gives them a spot for building their lodge. Now, occasionally it does happen that beavers won't build a dam, because if there's a pool of water available, say a small pond that's already there, or like down by the berm in Fontenelle Forest, I don't know that I've ever seen a dam down there. That's just a pool of water, but there's clearly beaver living in that. I don't even know if there's a lodge down there because they sometimes will dig into the bank. So I think our beavers down there do that. But when they do build dams, the purpose is to create an area of still water that gives them a place for their lodge and also gives them access to their preferred food source. So what they prefer to do is flood an area like you see up here on the upper right, and then they can swim up to all these trees and they can use those for their lodge, or they can feed on those. And that way they don't have to get out of the water, because a beaver on land is an awkward thing and it's a vulnerable thing. So if they can stay in the water where they're much safer, that's better for them. Now, the average length of a beaver dam is about 20 feet. The average width is about 4 feet wide. And the average height is about 6 feet tall with about 4 to 6 feet of water behind it. Now, the world record beaver dam is this one you see here on Google Earth. And this beaver dam is over 1/2 mile long. And what it is it actually was several different beaver dams, and they just kept building and building and building until eventually it all came together to create one gigantic 1/2 mile long beaver dam. And this is located in Canada. So now what triggers a beaver to build a dam? Well, it's actually the sound of running water. So you and I hear this. Hear this nice, soothing, oh, if I was camping near that would put me right to sleep at night. So that's what you and I hear. But that sound to a beaver sounds more like this. So they're actually triggered to build a dam by the sound of running water. They've done experiments where they took a small battery powered, like a tape recorder, and they started playing the sound of running water on it, and they just set it out there, and the beaver in the area would come and build a dam over the top. So even though there was not necessarily any water right there, they weren't damming up any water, but they were motivated to try and stop that sound, because to them that sound means there's a breach in the dam and we need to fix it. So now lodges are created from branches and mud. So they'll actually cover their lodge in the autumn with a whole fresh coat of mud. They'll dig it up and they'll put it over the top of that lodge. And what happens then is it freezes. And if you know anything about frozen mud, it might as well be concrete. So what that does is it helps prevent predators like wolves or coyotes or mountain lions. In the wintertime, when that lodge is accessible because maybe the pond froze over, so now all those predators that they were safe from during the summer when the water was there, now they're kind of vulnerable. And if they can dig in through the top of that lodge, the beaver are going to be in trouble. So they cover it with mud, and then in the wintertime when the pond is frozen, all that mud is frozen too, and it's basically like concrete. And the predators would have a really, really hard time breaking through that to get to the beaver. So the temperature inside the lodge actually stays, I won't say toasty, but it stays well above freezing. Even when outside the lodge, it might be, below zero, might be, 10, 20, 30 below. Inside the lodge, it's going to be, closer to 35. So it's kind of cool. So they have an underwater entrance that they'll come in. They usually have two different chambers in there. One for drying off, because you don't want to track water into your sleeping quarters. And then they have one area that's basically where they live. And sometimes muskrats will actually join them in these lodges. So they'll have there's actually been observations of muskrats living alongside the beaver in the beaver lodge. So that's kind of cool. They get along. So beaver family life, the basic unit the basic family unit or the basic unit of a beaver group is a family. It's a male and a female adult, which are monogamous. And usually they're kits and they're 1-year-olds. So they're kits from this year and whatever kits they had the year before. Now, generally at 2 years old, the beavers will disperse. They'll go out and try to make their way in the world, find their own mate, build their own lodge, maybe build their own dam. But they often don't go very far. Like I said, beavers they're not walking long distances, so it's kind of whatever they can relatively easily swim to, and they'll create their own group. Now, historically speaking, and that's what we're going to get into now, because I find this fascinating. Historically speaking, prior to the 1600s, there were 60 million beaver in North America. So you can see this range map, all this green. Even down here, you see down into, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, with the exception of a little bit of Nevada here and Southern California where it's really dry. There were beaver in areas where you would never think there would be a whole lot of beaver. Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, that's practically the desert. So why would there be beaver there? But the landscape at that time looked very different. So writings from the time talk about beaver filled the inland lakes, creeks, and ponds all the way to the Rockies. So imagine, if you will, Western Nebraska, but with a whole lot more water. So David Thompson, a surveyor who arrived in Hudson Bay in 1784, wrote that North America, above the 40th parallel, so this was 184 years or so later, North America above the 40th parallel may be said to have been in possession of 2 distinct races of beings, man and the beaver. And the 40th parallel runs right almost the southern border of Nebraska. So that's about the 40th parallel. Meriwether Lewis, in July of 1805, wrote that Captain Clark saw a number of beaver dams succeeding each other in close order and extending as far up those streams as he could discover in their course towards the mountains. So nowadays you go out to the western parts of Nebraska and you start getting into Wyoming, and it gets real dry, and the creeks and the streams are very seasonal. So they'll run in the spring when the snow is melting, but then they kind of dry up in the summer, or they're barely a trickle in the summer. Well, when Lewis and Clark went out there, those would have all been filled with water. And we're going to talk about why that is. Beaver keep water on the landscape. Now, the other reason one of the main reasons actually for the decline of the beaver was not necessarily castoreum, but beaver hats. And when I talk about beaver hats, I'm not necessarily talking about a hunter's cap like this with the ear flaps. I'm sure they did make some like this out of beaver. But for the most part, what they were making was felt hats. Felting involves shaving the under hairs, so those very short hairs that are close to the skin of the beaver, pressing them into sheets. So they would press them down into this kind of a sheet of pliable fabric. And those under fur hairs have microscopic barbs, and so they stick together. They would intertwine almost like Velcro, and they would stick together. And that made beaver felt much superior to wool or rabbit because it was waterproof and it stuck together. So these are the kinds of hats that they were making. This was all the rage in Europe. Abe Lincoln's top hat was made of beaver fur. So these are the types of hats that they were making out of this beaver fur. And trading in beaver goes back to the 1500s. So it's got a long history. So even prior to the arrival of the colonists here in the US, this was going on in Europe. So there was a big rush in the early 1600s. And the reason for that kind of beaver gold rush in North America was because by that time, the 1600s, when people arrived here, the European beaver was pretty much extinct. They had hunted it almost to extinction. So the wealth of beaver in the New World, they come here to the New World, and oh my God, there's 60 million beaver running around. Well, that was just irresistible. So the French and the English and the Dutch and the Swedes were vying for control of these trapping grounds. So, you know, we've all heard the story of the Dutch buying the island of Manhattan from the Lenape Indians, right? So really, they didn't necessarily want the island itself. They didn't necessarily want the land so much as they wanted the 7,000 beaver pelts that were sent back to Amsterdam. So from 1550 or so to about 1830, beaver hats were very fashionable. They were all the rage, and colonists actually used beaver pelts to pay their debts. A lot of them, when they we're going to sail to the New World, we're going to make a new life, but we need a loan to do it. And so part of what they did to repay that debt was beaver pelts. And the Revolutionary War wasn't just about taxes and tea. It was partially sparked because England at the time refused to let colonists access hunting grounds west of the Appalachians. So England wanted those beaver furs pelts for themselves. They didn't want to let the colonists go over there and trap them so that they could pay their debts. So that's actually was part of the impetus for the Revolutionary War. Now, by the mid 1800s, so shortly after Lewis and Clark went out exploring, beaver were much more scarce in the lower 48 states, because that hunting was just, you know, like we tend to do, we go get it, and not necessarily in a good way. So by the mid 1800s, beaver that had already been hunted to extinction in Europe were now very scarce in the lower 48 states. So the Hudson's Bay Company is kind of an interesting point in this story. So Hudson's Bay had a monopoly over the region that was drained by all the rivers, all the streams that emptied into the Hudson Bay, which is up here in Canada. So they were incorporated in 1670, and at its peak, Hudson's Bay controlled the fur trade throughout the English and British controlled North America. It's kind of a interesting history, kind of a not so great history, I think, when you get into it. But in the mid 1800s, they instituted protective measures and quotas in the Western Canadian interior to stop the beaver's decline. Now, this wasn't out of some concern for, oh, we're hunting out the beaver and they're a keystone species and we really should probably preserve them because they're important to the ecosystem. This was just good business. This was, hey, if we hunt out all the beavers, we're not going to be in business anymore. So they started instituting some quotas. Now, at the same time, just to give you an idea, they planned to create what they called a fur desert south and east of the Columbia River in Oregon. And this was to discourage rival traders. So that just goes to show they weren't doing this out of an abundance of concern for the beaver, because they were willing to do kind of a scorched earth policy to mess with the competition. So they had one of the heads of Hudson Bay Company actually wrote, "The Snake River is a rich preserve of beaver, which for political reasons we shall endeavor to destroy as fast as possible." So yeah, so we kind of did this on purpose. The beaver and the wolf are the two animals that we've almost intentionally driven to extinction in our history. Now, as we started to mature as a country, we started to realize that, beavers perform a lot of great ecological services. There's a lot of amazing stuff that they do. So as early as 1939, Idaho recognized the beaver's ability to stabilize eroded areas. So they started trapping and releasing them into these wilderness areas. And in 1941, Idaho made headlines when 5 beavers crucially stabilized a water supply in salmon Idaho, and that saved the city the cost of a dam. So they were already that early, 1939, recognizing, or 1941, recognizing that the ecosystem services that are provided by beavers actually can save us money. And we don't have to build these things because the beavers will build them for us. In the late 40s, early 50s, they actually had a program where they airdropped beavers into remote areas to help restore populations. So, and it's kind of an interesting story. They wanted to do this, but what they found was if you trap a beaver and you strap two 60-pound beavers on the sides of horses, the horses don't really like it that much. And these were wilderness areas, so you couldn't really drive in. There weren't roads. The only way in was to walk or to take pack animals. But this was the end of the 40s, early 50s, that some enterprising person said, hey, you know, we got a lot of, you know, World War II surplus planes sitting around. So what they did was this guy created a crate that you could push out of a plane, and parachute would open and it would float down. And when it hit the ground, it would open up like a clamshell. So when it touched down, it would open up and that would release the beaver. So they did this. They released, can't remember exactly how many it was, 60 or 90. They would airdrop them in. And it was actually, they established themselves and reproduced, and they did really well. There was only one fatality. Somehow there was one beaver that somehow managed to get out of the crate mid-air, and that was the only fatality. But otherwise, it was actually a pretty successful approach, and very innovative too. So some of the benefits that beaver provide us. One is water storage. So research has found that areas with beavers, there's an increase in stream flow in seasonally dry streams because they store water during the wet season. So they create that pond. So instead of that water, you know, flowing out and being gone, the pond traps it and it stores it there, and it lets it out more gradually. So it was associated with a 9-fold increase in open water area. It decreased stream temperature. And this is actually counter to what they thought. They thought because beaver they're gonna cut down the trees and the brush along the sides, it's gonna, you know, make more exposure to the sun. They thought it would increase stream temperatures, but it didn't. It actually decreased stream temperature because those ponds were deeper. So the water near the bottom stayed colder, and that's what was running out. So the stream temperature decreased, which is good for fish. A lot of times if the stream temperatures get too high, it's not good for trout and for salmon and for the fish that use those streams. It also increased water quality. So it increased water quality because it traps sediment. And when beaver ponds then fill in with sediment, they become wet meadows. And so it's this dynamic process where they become wet meadows. Or sometimes the dam breaks and then that sediment is released, but it benefits things because it's good soil for growing. It traps pollutants. So it helps trap pollutants, which reduces nutrient loading and what we call dead zones. So if you get too much nitrogen in an area, it can kill off all the plant life. It raises the water table. So that's a good thing, because if we use groundwater for a lot of things. So if it raises the water table, well, that helps the plants, all over, because now they don't have to try as hard, have as deep a root systems to get to the water. By storing water and slowing the flow, it increases infiltration into aquifers. So it gives the water, again, it gives it time to percolate down into the soil, get down into the aquifer and replenish those aquifers. And if you live in Nebraska, aquifers are important. The Ogallala Aquifer is where we draw most of our water in Nebraska. It decreases stream bank erosion. So again, because it slows that flow down, erosion is caused by water moving, and the faster it moves, the more it can erode, the more energy it has. So by slowing down that flow, it decreases erosion and it mitigates flooding, because again, it's storing the water on the landscape. It's not just letting it all, fly out of the system. So this is an interesting kind of project. This is Susie Creek, Nevada. And in 1991, there were no beavers here. And this is what it looked like here on the left. So you can see it's this tiny little stream. You can see the sides, how eroded they are, got these steep banks, and there's hardly any vegetation. So what they did was, this was an area that was a cattle range, and it was being severely overgrazed. So they decided to do some restoration. So the first thing they did was they fenced off part of the creek, and they started doing what's called prescriptive grazing practices. So they only allowed the cattle in those areas during certain times of the year, usually when the vegetation, like the spring, when the vegetation's doing well. And then in the summertime, when it's down, you would not let the cattle in there. So what they found was the beaver came back. They didn't even know there were beaver nearby. But then by 2008, they had beaver there. And because of the beaver dams, because of the beaver being there, it stored much more water on the landscape. And you can see in 2008, this is a much wider creek. The vegetation on the stream banks is much taller, much more lush. So imagine then, going back to what I said about pre-1600s, there were 60 million beaver, and this is Nevada. This is not, this is not the humid, wet Pacific Northwest or the Southeast. Imagine this in Western Nebraska with 60 million beaver. Imagine how much wetter the entire country would have been at that point in time. It's really amazing. So here's what they found in that Susie Creek Basin. Riparian vegetation over the 20 to 30 years increased by 100 acres. Beaver dams went from 0 to 139. I love that. Like that's a lot of beavers from 0. But we don't have any beavers. And then the beavers show up, and 20 to 30 years later, they've got 139. Open water increased by 20 acres. The length of wetted stream increased by 3 miles. And there was a 32% increase in photosynthetic activity. Now, if you're a cattle rancher and you can see an increase in vegetation, a 32% increase in photosynthetic activity, this is great. This is great for cattle ranching, because all you did was change kind of the behavior of your cattle. And now you've got free food for your cows, because now you don't have to buy as much hay. You don't have to truck water in. You've suddenly found that this beavers and cattle, they work great together, because the beavers provide you with a lot of things your cattle are going to need. So it's pretty cool stuff. Like I said, beaver are keystone species. So other species benefit from these beaver ponds. So waterfowl, so especially ducks, geese, and trumpeter swans, they love beaver ponds. Other birds like owls, kingfishers, herons, egrets, they're found in greater numbers where they're beaver. And that makes sense. They're wading birds, or fishing birds. So herons and egrets are going to wade in the water, and they're going to eat some of those crustaceans and amphibians and things like that. Beaver ponds, yes, they kill trees, which is not necessarily a bad thing. So those beaver ponds, those dead trees that were killed by the beaver, they're going to benefit woodpeckers. And because woodpeckers start holes, then there's other birds that use those later on. So wood ducks, titmice, and other cavity nesting birds, they're going to move in. Trout and salmon. The presence of beaver dams has been shown to increase either the number of fish, the size of the fish, or both. And beaver are associated with a 52% increase in survival for steelhead trout. So that's amazing. There's a great book I'm going to show you at the end. And I laughed when I read part of it, because when they were trying to reintroduce beaver into parts of the Pacific Northwest where they have the big, salmon runs and things like that, where they've dammed up a lot of the rivers and the streams for things, somebody tried to make an argument that the trout, they weren't going to be able to make it upstream because these beaver dams were going to block them. Now, we've created giant hydroelectric dams, and we've created, you know, the solution to letting the fish get up is fish ladders. So it's if you've ever seen a fish ladder, it's an artificial thing that comes down kind of a ramp, and then the fish use that. And it made me laugh because I thought, we build dams and we made fish ladders and didn't think twice about the fish figuring out how to use a fish ladder that we humans created. But the fish and the beaver coexisted for thousands or millions of years before we got here. And the fish figured out a way to get past the beaver dams. I think they can do it again. Other animals that are benefited: mink, muskrat, raccoons, elk, moose, frogs, turtles. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. So beavers are great on the landscape. So, and this is a project in Oregon called the METHOW Beaver Project. And what they do, their slogan is storing water for the future, one beaver at a time. So what they'll do is they'll trap nuisance beavers, nuisance in quotes. I kind of cringe at the use of the term nuisance beavers, because just like a lot of things, they're only a nuisance in relationship to us and our intentions. So, you know, a nuisance beaver might be one that builds near a culvert in a road and floods the road. Okay, that's a problem. I prefer to think of them as inconveniently located beavers. But what they'll do then is they'll trap these nuisance beavers, and they'll hang on to them, and they'll try to make a love connection. So they'll get a male and a female, and they'll pair them up. And if the two of them, you know, mate and are willing to, or appear willing to be a pair, then they relocate those mated pairs. And what that does is it helps keep them in one place. Because if you take one beaver, if you take a male beaver and you relocate him somewhere, you stick him out on a stream, what he's going to do is go try to find a mate. So he's not necessarily going to stay where you put him or where you want him, because he's going to go out and find a mate. If you relocate a mated pair and you put them in a good environment, well, they're going to stay there, and they're going to build, and then they're going to mate, have a family, and go from there. So what this METHOW Beaver Project tries to do is help retain beavers then on private land. So they don't trap them if they don't have to. They try to educate landowners about the benefits of having the beaver there, and some ways for them to coexist. The other thing that they're doing is they're actually building beaver dam analogs. So we've learned from the beaver, you know, what these benefits are. And if we don't have beaver available, then sometimes they'll build what's called a beaver dam analog. So they'll basically, human beings building beaver dams that look just like beaver dams, or look very similar and serve the same purpose. And this is a fascinating thing. This is called a beaver deceiver. So like I said, beavers are triggered by the sound of running water. So they'll build a dam. So sometimes they build dams where we don't want them. You know, in this bottom left picture, you can see there's a culvert here. And what they were trying to do is prevent the beaver, because the beaver kept building in front of this culvert, and that was a problem. So basically they caged it off. They have a tube running over here. They have this caged off, and that kind of, you know, really the beaver in this case, it only need to be pushed back about, you know, 20, 30 feet. It's just the specific spot it was trying to build a dam was a problem. So they built this beaver deceiver, and it pushed it back, and you can kind of see at the top of this picture where the dam is now, and that's not a problem. And then what they can also do is they'll insert these tubes, because if they're trying to maybe control the depth of the beaver pond, they don't want it to get too deep, because then it's a problem. But as long as it stays, you know, 4 feet versus 5 feet, it's okay. So they put this tube in, and then the beaver pond will drain out to the depth that we want it. So there's some ways that we can kind of coexist with beavers. You know, we can kind of, you know, like, hey guys, I know that you really want to build a dam here, and I don't mind having you around, but we gotta come to a decision here. We gotta reach a compromise. So there's some ways that we can compromise with the beavers, and we can all get along. So some great reading on this topic if you're interested. Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter. Wonderful book, really gets into the kind of the beaver deceivers and a lot of those ecosystem services that beavers provide. And then Once They Were Hats, In Search of the Mighty Beaver is another great book. And that really gets into the history of the hunting and the trapping of the beavers and the felting and all that kind of stuff. And kind of a lot of the things that you'd be surprised by in terms of beavers. So that brings us to the end of this last Understanding Nature program. And just so you guys know, I actually moved to Virginia about a year ago. So I've been doing these programs from my house in Virginia. And with the end of COVID and the return to in-person programming, that kind of puts me in a position where I don't have anything that I can do for the forest anymore, really, which I'm eternally grateful to the forest. I loved working there. And I actually, you know, with my move, because my wife's active duty Air Force, I kept this job. I kept going part-time as long as I could. I actually kept this job about a year longer than I really thought I would. So it's been wonderful. And to that end, because I'm now too far to commute to Fontenelle Forest, I've actually started my own business here in Virginia called Dispatches from the Forest, where I'm going to be going into elder care facilities in my area and doing nature-related programming. That's actually what I did pre-COVID for Fontenelle Forest. There's somebody new doing that now. But if you've enjoyed this Understanding Nature series, if you've enjoyed listening to me ramble on about all the nature things that make me excited, please check out my Facebook page, Dispatches from the Forest. I'm on Facebook. And I'm going to be starting a podcast, and Matt Darling, the new executive director at Fontenelle Forest, very graciously told me I could plug this at the end of today's program. If you've enjoyed this series, please check out my new podcast, Dispatches from the Forest. My very first episode will be going up on Podbean tomorrow. So make yourself a note to go to Podbean, check it out. I'm going to have a Patreon. If you like the podcast and you want to contribute that way, that would be great. So again, that's dispatchesfromtheforest.podbean.com. I hope you'll go check it out and give it a like, maybe give it a follow. I'll be putting out new episodes about every 2 weeks. So thank you all for joining me all these times. I've enjoyed it. I hope you've enjoyed it too. Do I have any questions from my Zoom group? Oh, I just saw I have a chat question. So the logo, somebody said they really liked the logo. For the record, and I just want to give credit where credit's due, the general idea was mine. I kind of knew what I wanted, but my oldest child, who's going into 9th grade, had taken a digital art class last year, and so they really did the majority of that. My wife contributed a little bit of suggestions, but mostly that was them. And I half jokingly referred to them as my unpaid interns. So my unpaid interns did a great job, and I will let them know. The recording will be available. I will get that to our marketing people, and hopefully they will get it up on YouTube. Also, you can always go watch it on Facebook Live because it will be there as soon as the program's over. So I'm happy to hear that everybody enjoyed it. They said they thought I might be a ham. I'm not sure what that means. The current beaver population, let me ask what the current beaver population is. I think we're right around 100 million, but I might be just pulling that out of thin air. I'd have to look that up. Or not, sorry, not 100 million. That would be too many. That would be more than we had to start with. Yeah, I would have to look that up. I'm not sure what the current beaver population is. Oh, a ham, a licensed amateur radio. I thought you meant like a ham, like hamming it up. No, I'm not a ham radio operator. I'm just going to be putting out a podcast. Well, all right, everybody. Thanks again. Enjoy this beautiful July day. I hope it's a beautiful July day there in Nebraska. It's hot and humid here in Virginia, but hope you all have a great day. Get out to Fontenelle Forest and go look for the beaver in Fontenelle Forest. Maybe you'll catch a glimpse.